Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. A very warm welcome to Keys, our monthly broadcast to Ipsos's clients all around the world. It's the 30th of January. We've almost completed a month. Well done, everybody. But a whole year lies ahead. So where are we now? What happens next? And how can we all be better informed as we think about what we need to achieve this year, whatever it is that we're doing and in whatever country we're in. And to help us do that, I have a wonderful panel of colleagues who are going to give us their perspectives on the year ahead. We think resilience is going to be required, some good humour, some evidence, and hopefully we've got some of that in good measure today. Joining us from the wonderful city of Manchester, we have my colleague Jack Evans, who is going to help us think through how we work and how we can lead our teams and our colleagues in 2025. We then have Alexandra, who's in New York today, where it's very early. Thank you, Alexandra, for being with us today, who's going to help us think about how we get around this year, but also in the years ahead. And then Sue, who's back from Switzerland in London today, is going to think about, or tell us about, how we need to think through the ever-changing ESG agenda that our organisations face. Lots of time for us to respond to questions as we go through the session, so please type them into the box and we'll ask the presenters at the end, and any that we can't get to we'll follow up afterwards. We'll also make sure that you have all of the slides from today in your inbox tomorrow, including some bonus slides that we think might be useful to you as well. So thank you for being with us. What I've tried to do to start us is to think about the economic state that we're in at the start of the year, and to think about it particularly from the public's perspective. What do they see when they think about economics, but more importantly perhaps their own financial circumstances? And I'll start perhaps with just having a think from more of a helicopter view of where economists are and what the economists see. Because as we were moving towards the end of the last year, it did feel like we had some good news. Here we have OECD headline inflation slowing in the final quarter of the year. And in 27 out of 38 OECD countries, we were seeing declining inflation. Now, I don't know if economists use emojis much, but that might have been a moment for them to do that. However, further down that same report, the same economist noted something that the public absolutely see, which is that price levels across the OECD were approximately 30% higher than they had been 5 years previously across that whole swathe of 38 markets, 38 countries. And that's certainly what the public see, and that's what the public tell us in our regular polling. What the Where is the World study had inflation as the #1 concern for 11 of the 12 months of 2024. And when we look at the whole year in a panorama, we spotted that worry levels are actually on the rise when it comes to inflation in a number of countries, including the world's largest economy, the US, and indeed the most populous country, India. So those concerns hadn't gone away. And we've been reflecting in 2024 at Ipsos about what the public were telling us. And we felt we needed to take a little bit of a look at the language that we use in our work. We were modestly proud, if that's possible, of our global inflation monitor, which had been running for a couple of years. But we felt we needed to rethink the title, and we now call it the Cost of Living Monitor. And we've actually rethought some of the questions to make sure we ground them in people's real lives, because we can all be in no doubt that the pain that people were feeling and have been feeling over a number of years now when it comes to cost of living pressures cut through. It cut through to those of us working in business. It also cut through at the ballot box with those usually disastrous results for incumbent governments around the world. And as we moved into this year, 2 elections that are being prepared for, of course, Germany, the background when we're looking at the economic state that they're in is that consumer confidence has been falling in recent times. In Canada, big concerns about inflation and big expectations that it's the federal government that needs to sort things out when it comes to, for example, the housing crisis in that country. So what happens next? We've been drawing on our annual prediction survey to have a think about where people's minds are as they look towards the year ahead. And in terms of the economy, certainly, one can be forgiven for saying there's lots of cause for alarm. Prices will rise faster than incomes, taxes will be higher, inflation will be higher, unemployment will rise, interest rates will be higher. This all seems rather depressing, and it kind of is, but the one thing to just reflect on is a reminder that often it's really helpful to have that passage of data over time. And I think the big thing we took away from that is that people's outlook certainly muted, but remains relatively unchanged on most measures compared with where we were last year. Indeed, on interest rates, that 61% saying things will be higher is actually a little bit less gloomy than we had at the same point last year. And indeed, we are seeing some signs of some optimism in some places. Certainly thinking about our own lives, we're seeing a little bit more than a couple of years ago when it comes to, will this year be a better one for us in our lives? And we're also seeing some improvements on expectations for the global economy. You'll note, though, that we're not yet back to the levels that we were measuring before COVID times. You'll also note, as so often in our work, when we do international studies, that the country context matters so much. So we do find a number of countries, when we're looking at that question on the global economy, where there is a reasonable degree, let's say, of optimism, particularly in some of the Asia markets, in some of the LATAM markets, and also in the US. Those of us who are based in Europe will note less positivity. 7 of the bottom 10 countries on this measure, including my own, are in the lower end of the spectrum. But always we have to think about the country context, and always trying to stay close to what is happening now. And we do have some new data released over the last week, which I'm just going to share with you the latest on that front. This is where we're looking at the percentage of people who say the economy is in good shape in their country. And I'm just looking at the G7 countries for the moment, because there is a little bit of alarm signals there when we're looking at them. If I look at the period before COVID, and I'm sorry for the busy chart, the main thing to note is that there was quite a big difference between the different countries, between Germany and Italy, in terms of their economic assessment as we went into 2020. If we look at where we are now, we'll note that the arrow is rather smaller. There's less variation between countries, and the assessments are at a more gloomy level. The US does best of those major economies, 38% saying things are in good shape. Canada, election coming, much less positive than before. Germany, election coming, much less positive than before. France, maybe an election coming, at least for the in some for the Parliament, we'll see. Only 10% of people say the economy is in good shape. So real questions there in many of the G7 markets, but indeed all around the world. Our latest What Worries the World findings, just released this month, find inflation to be #1 on the overall markers for what's worrying the world. Turkey and Singapore are top, but a number of countries still have that as the #1 concern. And if we track that back over time, clearly we've all been through COVID. That was our first experience, let's say, of that big shock when we're looking at tracking public opinion over time. We didn't have it on our questionnaire in 2020. We didn't know about pandemics. It was the #1 issue for a couple of years. But as COVID worries subsided, we saw that rise in cost of living concerns, a little bit lower than they were, let's say, a year or 18 months ago, but certainly very much there, and joining those perennial topics about crime, unemployment, corruption that worry people in countries around the world. So to sum up the economic state we're in, I actually find it rather difficult. In fact, I reverted to some analysis we were doing a couple of years ago. It's still the same. We were quite struck by The Economist's analysis, calling it the Mona Lisa economy, when we're thinking about what's happening internationally. No matter how many times you look, you're unsure quite what's happening. And it does seem to be the case today, just as it was 2 years ago. But certainly we can point to a number of themes from the data that we have. There is some optimism, but it's quite muted. Each country, a different story, of course, and we have to be careful about easy generalizations. Also, once you spot something, expect turbulence, and month on month we're seeing changes, particularly on that economic assessment score. Generally, things aren't as good in terms of consumer confidence as they were before 2020. So I put in the show notes some resources for you to keep in touch with the latest research that we've been doing, and we'll be tracking it throughout the year. But that's the context of the economy. We're all having to work in that context to lead our teams, and I'm delighted to welcome Jack Evans back to the Keys stage. Jack works for Ipsos Carrion and Box, and they're our employee research arm, experts in taking the temperatures of organizations all around the world. And Jack, thank you for putting together your thoughts about how we can work and how we can work better in 2025. Over to you.
Great, thanks Simon, thanks, good to be back. Yeah, I think that sets the scene really well, and I think what I'll talk about today is, if we've heard about the kind of macro picture, I guess what I will talk to you about is what does all that mean for the world of work, and how is that trickling down and impacting the businesses we work for, but also impacting us as individuals, because we don't leave all of those big trends that have an impact on us at the door. They kind of come with us. So that's what I will spend some time talking about. So we're working in a constantly changing world. Now, that statement and that slide could have been lifted from any presentation in the last 10 or 15 years. The world of work has always been changing, will always be changing. I think the things that are different are the factors that are driving that change and the pace at which that change is happening. And I don't think there's anything having a bigger impact on us right now than the AI revolution, and also nothing happening as quick as this. So I wrote these slides, or I started writing these slides about a week or so ago. At that point, no one had heard of DeepSeek, the Chinese AI chatbot. And now look, it's the #1 most downloaded app on the App Store. I think it wrote off $1 trillion of value to the US stock market in just one day. So I think that that's case in point as to how quick that change is happening. But it's not just that. We've got changing customer expectations based on all of the stuff that Simon talked about. We've got cost pressures as businesses face higher costs to them, and do I pass that on to my customers? Can I pass that on to my customers? How can I manage that a bit better? Changes to what work is, and is work something you do? Is work something you go to? We saw COVID accelerated that divide between those who can and can't work at home, and I think more recently there's a divide between the businesses who will and won't allow employees to do that. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. And finally, kind of potentially a change in direction on ESG and D&I programs, which Sue will talk about later, and unpack that in a bit more detail. But I think the real issue that we've got is that often with a lot of these big change factors and driving forces of change, we've got our chief execs and our executive leadership teams on one end of the spectrum, and then we've got our employees on the other end of the spectrum, totally opposed on what these changes and these factors mean for us in our organizations. And therefore the challenges for us as leaders, often we're stuck in the middle of that. We're stuck in the middle of those two groups who are kind of diametrically opposed to each other. And there's nothing that creates a divide quite like AI does, as you might have kind of suspected. This is the first place that we'll start. And again, you see this opposition. So on the one hand, you've got senior leaders who say, great, AI is going to make my job easier. But I also think they see it as a golden ticket to efficiency, to being able to grow the top line revenue without having to grow our headcount and our cost base at the same kind of rate. You know, they see it as a real way to solve some of those business challenges. On the other end of the spectrum, you've then got employees thinking, well, hang on, what does this mean for me, for my job, for the security of my job in the long run? Quite concerned about the impact that the AI will have on them, their job, their future. We see a similar divide when it comes to this idea of where we work and what work is. In the early stages of the economy reopening after the pandemic, when going back into office environments was kind of optional, we saw senior leaders going in much more often and being much more comfortable and confident to go in than employees. So it's no surprise that here we are years later, it feels like week after week, month after month, big organizations doing really big initiatives to get people back into the office, or at least get them back in more often. And, you know, largely they're being unsuccessful and fighting a losing battle with that. And I think that's because, again, employees are at the opposite end of the spectrum. So research we did last year talked about over a third of employees actually want to spend less time in the office, where you've got employers trying to pull them back more often. And I think what we find with this, at least from an employee experience perspective anyway, is that there's a happy medium that we should be striving for, and that's 3 days a week in an office environment, 2 more flexibly. And I think that's a potential way that we can at least put one of these divides to bed and bring people together a little bit more. And also on D&I, as I said, Sue will unpack this more. I think political pressures in the last kind of 4 to 6 weeks has seen big organisations possibly pointing towards changing their approach and rowing back on some of their D&I programmes. Yet actually, the experience of employees day to day shows that there's a lot of progress still needs to be made. I think every client that I've worked with over the course of my career, every single one of those has got a gap in experience between employees in those, classed as those minority groups, whether that's women, colleagues from a Black and ethnic minority background, those with a disability. Every single organisation has a gap in experience between those employees. So clearly there's more work to be done, and we'll see how that one pans out. So this change is constant. There's always going to be something that is causing change in organisations, and I think what happens is all of that external change, that macro level change that's happening, well, that creates change directly in organisations as businesses and the leaders within it have to respond to and react to what's happening in the outside world. And more often than not, that comes in the form of rethinking, reshaping, and redirecting where their organisations going. So you can see there 4 in 10 organisations in the UK restructured last year. So you can see the trend of that, and I think that will only increase as we get into 2025. And the other thing we know is that yes, all of this change is happening, but how does it impact people from a human perspective? That's what it comes down to, and we know that it does. So data we collect over a number of years with our clients shows engagement relatively stable over a period of time. A change event happens, whether that's a restructure, as I just talked about, or a change in direction for that organisation, a new strategy, whatever it may be. And we see engagement start to dip, and it kind of follows this classic change curve pattern. People then stay at the bottom of that change curve anywhere from 12 to 24 months while they move through that change curve and that change cycle, understand what it means for them, and start to then really come out the other side of it. And that's where we see that slow but steady return to normal over anywhere from a 6 to 12 month period. Now that would all be fine and totally manageable if we were going through one singular change at any one moment in time. The reality of that is that doesn't happen. What is happening in all of our organisations and all of our lives is that we're going through multiple cycles of this change curve. We're constantly moving through it, often in parallel, rather than coming out of one and straight into the next one. they're all condensed, you know, and that's the challenge that we're faced with now. The impact of that is that over time, I talked about that return to normal. That return to normal doesn't happen. Change has an attritional impact on engagement, and we start to see gradually over a period of time that engagement dips. And Simon talked about resilience in his introduction. Resilience is the key thing that A, speeds up this change curve and this change cycle, but B, means that we move through it with less of a dip. So we don't go as low in terms of engagement as we saw in that first graphic. And we also see all of this playing out in terms of, you know, direct impact on our people. So strain is higher than ever. We saw that with research we did last year. People turning to Google to get support with things like burnout is something that we know is a trend. And I guess, what does that mean then? So what does all of that mean for us as leaders in our roles, in our organizations? And I think it comes down to better change management is the key thing. So if we think about the amount of money and time and energy that we're spending on these change initiatives, actually we're trying to get people and humans to move through them. So we need to concentrate on how do we support people through that change? How do we manage them through that change curve? And we can move them through as quickly and effectively as possible. Doing that with empathy is absolutely critical. And also doing that with a leadership team who lead from the front, who really believe and buy into the idea that happy and healthy employees reaches our bottom line, and really lead from the front and demonstrate that they care around their own engagement, happiness, well-being, and therefore they care about that of their people. So that was a whistle-stop tour, and I'm conscious that was super quick. So in terms of wrap up, the world is constantly changing, always will be, always has been. And we see the impact of that trickling down into our workplaces. The thing that changes is the factors that are causing that change and the pace at which it's happening. And we see this idea that leaders and employees are at opposite ends of the spectrum on that, on those change forces. And the impact of all of that is that burnout is higher, strain is higher, and therefore what can we do as leaders to really support our people through that? And that's the thing that I will leave you with before I hand back to you, Simon. We're all leaders, we're all individuals, we're all moving through these change curves at our own pace, and I'd encourage each of you to think around, you know, whether it's today, tomorrow, next week, what is one thing that you can do based on what we've talked about so far today, and really do that to try and make a difference. Simon, back to you.
Well, thank you. We'll food for thought there, and well, I'm just thinking about your question myself, but I'll do that later. In terms of you know, your themes, I mean, you talked about change being ever present, and whether that's AI or the alarming number of reorganizations that employees around the world seem to be going through. So, you know, clearly change is always with us, as you reminded us. But you know, what would be your advice about the enduring things that are really important for? I think, you know, probably most of us on this call are managing teams and looking to do the right thing with, let's say, with our colleagues and for our organization. What are your enduring top tips for us?
Yeah, I think when we look back at the kind of the early academic research, at least from work psychologists on, you know, what makes people happy at work, what makes them want to stay working for their organization, that research is probably 50, 75 years old. Actually, it still stays true today in terms of the core fundamental things. And I think it's, you know, having a manageable amount of work that's expected of you, a degree of autonomy and control over how you do that work. The work is interesting, it's fulfilling in some kind of way. You're doing that in a job that's secure. You know, you're working with people who you have trusting relationships with. It's those kind of real base level fundamentals. And I think as leaders, we mustn't lose sight of that, because all of the change that we take our organizations through, it threatens one or more of those basic fundamental things in one way or another. And I think using that as a bit of a frame, you know, how is it changing those fundamental things that are important to people, I think will stand us all in good stead, really. Thank
you. Wise advice, and we'll back to you later, because I've already got some questions for you that we'll take in the Q&A. Now, somebody who's clearly got a manageable amount of work is Alexandra, because he's got about 5:30 in the morning and he's working already. Thank you, Alexandra, for being with us in New York this morning. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on how we're going to get around, whether it's to work or to our leisure activities. Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. I'll try to give an overview of the learnings or the insights we got from the automotive and mobility team. So in order to answer to your question, I'd like to start by looking back at 2024 and compare what we've read or what we've heard around what was going on in the automotive and mobility space with actually figures that we now have available from the year that has just ended. So what we've often heard in media in Western markets is that EV sales are not picking up. And now that the volume of new car sales is concluded for the last 12 months, we can see that actually that's not true. EV sales are up by 18%, while gas-powered vehicles sales, what we call ICE in the industry, are down by 11.5%. So the movement towards electrification is continuing. Actually, globally, it's continuing very, very significantly. We've also heard that traditional OEMs or car manufacturers are losing ground against Chinese players. That's largely true, but I think it's important to keep in mind that there is not an homogeneous group of Chinese brands. They all perform very differently. BYD has had a fantastic year. Chery has done very well as well. Geely is growing very fastly, but they all have different strategies. They all have a different lineup, a different strategy towards electrification. And you also have some Chinese group like SAIC, who are actually suffering. SAIC, among the biggest car manufacturers, is the one who posted the steepest decline in volume in 2024. So we should not consider that as a homogeneous group. And it's also true for the traditional OEMs. You have some that have resisted very well, others who have declined indeed, but it's much more complex than what the headlights are telling us. Another thing that we've heard analysts or opinion leaders saying, well, no, consumers want to revert to traditional cars. They are really not into electrification. Well, actually, in spite of the buzz and the bashing that we've seen in some cases in terms of for electrification, EV consideration remains in mature market very strong. When we ask consumers who are looking for purchasing a new car, if they would consider an EV, 50% of them tell us, yes, I would consider an electric car, and it's stable. It's stable at a very high level. Why is this stable? We analyze, that's one of the very interesting work that we do is the Ipsos Global Trend Survey. We analyze trends that are moving, that are shaping consumers' behaviors and attitudes. There are two that we've been noticing and following in the past years that are very strong in shaping consumers' behaviors. One is sustainability, and Sue will talk much better about it than I am. But when we see, so it's the fact that their consumers globally are more interested in sustainable products and behaviors than they were in the past. And indeed, when we look at the segmentation of consumers more engaged in that trend, we see that those are more likely to purchase an EV in the future as the trend is strong and is growing. Electrification continues. There is another trend that is also driving electrification. It's what we call tech acceleration. It's the fact that consumers are more and more willing to see technology embedded in the products and services they purchase, embedded in their daily life. Here again, the segments who are more engaged in that in adoption, in technology adoption, are more likely to purchase an EV in the future. So we see those are strong trends pushing for EV consideration. Having said that, so let's try to look at 2025. I was going to say the future, but it's actually also already the present. Times fly. Before we try to understand, what will happen in 2025, I'd like to remind everybody of what drives mobility decisions. And of course, there are consumers' attitudes and preferences. How we prefer the mode of transport that we prefer to use, and how we like. Do we like driving our car, using a bike, whatever. But there are also other elements which often, in my perspective, come before and shape our preferences, actually. The first one is what's the technology that is available in a given market, because it's distributed or not, and also because manufacturers are producing it or not. We know, especially when you think about the car industry, they've invested a lot of money in building factories, gigafactories to build batteries, or factories that are made to build electric car. This is what is becoming more and more available today. Another thing that is critical is the infrastructure to support the technology. If we go back 100 years ago, the growth of the automotive industry would not have been possible if governments had not built roads and gas stations everywhere. Well, today it's a bit the same. One of some barriers towards electrification are linked to the charging network, to the availability of charging stations. They're also linked to the electricity grids. There are big investments happening to make that infrastructure available. We also know, and I just very quickly, that the usage of public transportation is obviously clearly dependent on the availability of the network and the investments that are done in developing and maintaining that public transport network. Finally, there is another factor that drives mobility is regulations, public policies, public subsidies. We've seen that, and this is there are two elements here that are very present in the news. Subsidies to incentivize electrified cars have a great impact on the short term, at least, on the demand for electrified vehicles. So lots of the discussions around, okay, will we continue to subsidize? Will government stop or reduce the subsidies? That obviously has an impact, at least on the short term. And similarly, discussions around regulations and tariffs to allow products to come in the market or to make it more easier or more difficult, that also has a great impact. So what I want to say here is that if you think about it, the available technology, the infrastructure, even the consumer attitudes, those are factors that are actually pretty stable in time. And when having said that, you will not be surprised when I tell you that in 2025, we will probably listen to lots of debates and buzz around, will we have tariffs, will we not have tariffs, what will happen? But actually, we probably will not see a lot of change. I'm sorry, Simon. I hope you're not disappointed by the answer. But I've added yet into brackets, and maybe that will, and why did I yet? Because actually we see signals that change is probably coming. And to give an example, I'd like to share some data from the US market. I selected the US market because this is where car is king, obviously. And indeed, in the latest survey that we conducted in December, 92% of US consumers tell us my personal vehicle is my preferred method of travel. That's how I move around. And when there is a good reason for that is when we look at the specific usages of personal vehicle in the US, 80% almost are embedded in daily activities, shopping, daily errands, go to and from work. And this has been the case for decades in the US and elsewhere, but mainly in the US. However, we've seen something very interesting happening in 2024. For the first time, use for errands is outpacing use for commuting. It's a trend of, we talked about remote working. Jack told us how difficult it was for employers to bring back employees at work. And we see clearly that the COVID has accelerated that, and as speaking in the US to the fact that now indeed we are commuting much less with our cars, but the trend started before. We see that the trend started since 2015. Yes, 2019 was a big peak, but it continues and it continues to decline. So that means that actually consumers in the US are using their car much less, post-COVID that they did before. When we look at the number of miles driven annually, it has gone down by 16% since pre-COVID. This is true. Again, I'm using US as an example, but this is a trend that we see in most of the mature markets. And interestingly, at the same time, and we talked about inflation at the beginning, but when you look at the average price of new vehicles in the US, it has actually gone up by almost 50% since pre-COVID. We're on average $30,000, a little more now. We're at $45,000 in average in the US. And at the same time, the driver satisfaction with their new vehicle has gone down. So if you sum up this, yes, it's still their preferred vehicle, their preferred mean of transport for US consumers, but they're using their car less. It's a bit less embedded in their daily usage. It's more expensive. They're less satisfied. So you will not be surprised to see that 56% of US consumers, that's a nationwide survey. We're not talking about New Yorkers or inhabitants of big cities, are telling us, well, yes, I'm open to replace my personal vehicle with other means of transportation. So change in how we get around may not happen quickly in 2025, but I think there is clearly the opportunity for change and the willingness for consumers to the openness for other means of transportation. It may take a little bit of time because we have infrastructure, technology issues, regulations sometimes that need to come along, but there is willingness to change.
Thank you, Alexandra, for that panorama. And I just wanted to pause before we go to Sue about the alternative mobility points. I think that's you're talking about everything from public transport to e-scooters and e-bikes. If you had a crystal ball, which do you think are going to, let's say, accelerate or become more part of our daily lives 5 or 10 years from now?
I think it will. I think we will see much more fragmentation than we've seen in the past decade, and that's true for automotive, and that's true for mobility and for other industries, by the way. But because it depends largely on infrastructure and public policies. So in Europe, I'm actually pretty convinced that bikes and electrified bikes will go up, and we will use that even outside of cities much more than we are today, and smaller vehicles as well. We'll see much more smaller vehicles than we see today. In the US, I believe car sharing will grow, ride-hailing as well, but car sharing a lot. I think that makes sense. So it will depend on the infrastructure and on public policies largely.
Thank you. Well, and any more comments or questions you've got, please put them in the chat box, and we'll throw them back at Alexandra later. Now, one of the things I think I'm moving to Sue now, but Alexandra was reminding us to be careful. This year we may see debates and buzz, and we might need to keep our eyes on the bigger picture. Sue, ESG, what to do? I think there could be some parallels there. Over to you.
Great question, Simon. Environmental, social and governance, what to do. So you would have been living under a rock in the last couple of weeks if you'd not noticed that there have been some seismic pronouncements around ESG with the new administration in the US withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement and subsequently cancelling a number of diversity and inclusion policies in all federal departments, as Jack was talking about earlier on. So, but the politicization of ESG and diversity and inclusion did not start on the 20th of January. It had already started in the second half of 2024, and it continues to challenge both governments and businesses who are faced with the imperative to grow as countries and companies, while at the same time obviously ensuring equality of opportunity for everyone and protection for our planet from further destruction. So there is clearly a tension here, and ESG and DEI are at the centre of that tension. And I think it would be easy, wouldn't it? It is easy maybe for businesses to deprioritize sustainability when the obvious change that's required to deliver to the needs of the planet and its people can run counter to the demands of the loudest stakeholders. So growth, profitability, impacted by some of those geopolitical conflicts we're all experiencing, inflation you were talking about earlier, Simon, and the integration of AI, to name a few, they command much more urgent attention in the boardroom than sustainability. So is ESG dead? What are the CEOs telling us? So released last week, PwC's 28th annual Global CEO Survey told us that when sustainability talks the language of business, it will always be popular. So the investments they have made and been making over a number of years in sustainability are paying off. So behind the hype, we suggest many businesses will continue with their sustainability efforts because they make business sense. And it's the only way to remain sustainable as a business in the long term. So that's the view from the top. But what are the CSOs telling us, the Chief Sustainability Officers? So Ipsos has a soon-to-be released ESG Council report, which reveals that while 55% of Chief Sustainability Officers agree that some leaders are diluting their commitments to ESG, 90% agree that ESG is fundamentally changing the way businesses operate. And that's actually up from 83% in 2023. So adjusting, reframing, yes, but full reversal, definitely not. For sustainability officers, the debate is no longer whether climate change is occurring. It's now focused on the trade-offs required to meet the net zero goals that will stabilize these events. So what about people? What are the global consumers, people, citizens telling us about ESG? So citizens across the world agree strongly we are headed for environmental disaster without rapid change to our habits. So they see and acknowledge and appreciate the threat. But it's interesting to see actually how the answer to this question has actually changed over the years. And Ipsos in our trends report this year had climate convergence as one of its 9 global trends. Well, why convergence? Because a decade ago, there was a 34-point gap between China and the US, agreeing that we're headed for environmental disaster unless we change our habits. This gap has now shrunk to 12 points, with China's enthusiasm waning, but that's likely because they've seen some improvements, both in air quality and also that they're now the biggest producers and consumers of electric vehicles, as Alexandra mentioned earlier. And the UK and the US have increased their concern, likely because, again, of the increasing frequency of extreme climate events. But who should take responsibility? So they want companies to take the lead, and they want governments to legislate so that companies do take the lead. And they don't want them to greenwash. They are looking for transparency in what companies are doing and expecting governments to take greater control over this so that they're certain about what they are buying. But then people acknowledge too that they need to take some action. But 72%, that's nearly 3/4 of people say they're already doing all they can to save the environment. So you could interpret this as outrage and frustration at companies' inaction. But a more empathetic perspective would be to hear the lack of agency people feel to actually impact progress. So there's a need to bring consumers along the sustainability journey and engage them in the development of new offers, telling the positive story of progress and helping them play their role in that. But we need to do this well. And some work we've been doing with an organisation who are partners in Canada called Public, they're a social impact advertising agency in Canada. That shows us that 50% of Americans and Canadians have actually turned away from products due to confusing sustainability messaging. So science-based claims like carbon neutral or eco this, eco that are far less effective than claims that involve a more personal benefit. So claims around being locally sourced or made without chemicals harmful to humans resonate much more strongly and won't result in people turning away from your offers. But we know from all the research we've done that consumers don't buy products for their sustainability benefit alone. They don't buy something just because it's sustainable. But if you can partner a consumer benefit that we all know is important for the category alongside a sustainability benefit that's credible for your organization and your brand, you can improve your communications effectiveness, you can improve your brand equity and drive sales growth. And Hellmann's Mayonnaise is a great example of this. They partnered a great tasting superior product with the purpose of fighting food waste. They experienced 10% growth in 2020 and 11% in 2021, and it's continued obviously to be a very strong brand. So there's no doubt that if you do it right, it can result in strong business growth. So there's no doubt that the narratives that surround us will have an impact. Some companies will withdraw, others will reduce the commitments they make. But these commitments for many organizations were never made only for woke reasons. They were made because of the significant risks posed by climate change and the need to mitigate these risks. Because investing in things like water stewardship, sustainable farming methods, and reducing plastic will ensure the long-term sustainability of their business. The hype might distract some, but the momentum will continue in a positive forward direction. So I will finish with some words from Davos, where I was at a round table last week, and I'm sure many of you on this call are from insights teams working closely with marketing, and both marketing and insights have a clear role to play in driving progress in sustainability. So Ipsos is currently partnering with the Institute for Real Growth to identify how the Chief Marketing Officer and the Chief Sustainability Officer can work more closely together to deliver sustainability goals. And the three key headlines from that session last week, the roundtable session last week, was that there is a willingness to partner among both parties, but the language and the KPIs are not aligned. The second point is that the business case for sustainability still needs to be made in many organizations. It's not just about doing good, it's about doing good business. And finally, a mantra to reinforce that point from an organization that actually leads with sustainability and is one of the top sustainability organizations in the world is to do good, you have to do well and be a proud for-profit company. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Sue, for sharing us those perspectives, including from your session in Davos. So what I'm hearing is perhaps, to coin a phrase, keep calm, have a stock take, and carry on.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. You know, those initiatives that businesses have doing that are continuing to make good business sense for them, whether it's diversity and inclusion policies, probably need to be reframed and renamed, but actually having an environment that's inclusive for all, that supports underrepresented groups to have opportunities, because there's a huge talent pool that have previously been untapped. All of those initiatives, as well as obviously the environmental sustainability initiatives, will continue if they make good business sense.
Lovely, thank you. And for our viewers, we're going to be back in a couple of months actually with Sue and colleagues to look at some of these topics in more detail. And one of the things, Sue, you mentioned the point about regulation, but for colleagues who are from outside the EU, there are regulations about to hit the EU that may affect people all around the world, aren't there, in terms of accessibility? That's one thing you're tracking, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yes, accessibility, the European Accessibility Act comes into force in some of this in June this year, which means that all digital platforms will need to be accessible to people with disabilities, which is a very if you've got a bank, if you've got any digital interface, a mobile app that helps people buy your services, if it's not accessible to people with disabilities, you'll be breaking the law. So yes, these initiatives can continue and will continue, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to be diving deeper into those in the coming months. So I've got some questions. We've got time for a few questions to Alexandra and Jack as well. Alexandra had a question about the US, and I think your point around infrastructure, I think, has struck a bit of a chord. And the question is will US consumers really be able to make the shift in mobility that they might want to, but perhaps they may not be able to? Is that something you can see a different pathway?
Well, it's the infrastructure Obviously, so that's a complex question. I try to do, but it is driven by federal policies, but also by state policies. So in some markets, in some states, it will be easier than in others. That's for sure. And there is a question around of course, the number of charging stations, which are often privately funded, so that depends less of on the infrastructure that is funded by the governments, whether federal or state governments. But there is another question which is more linked to the electric grid, for the ability for consumers to actually charge at home, and this is less depending on government funding. It's more the electric companies who have to push for that. So I think it will take it takes time, because infrastructure, it doesn't happen from one day to the other. But I think yes, the trend is there. It will move.
Thank you for that. Question, Jack, about well, when people get to work. Alexander, thank you for that point about commuting. Actually, that's fascinating. About what's happening on this kind of 3-day, 4-day, 5-day back to the office. Are you seeing any patterns at all, or is it just one company does one thing and another does another? Is there any kind of cumulative learnings that you're seeing from the work you're doing?
I think it massively varies. I think probably the one trend we are seeing is that it's becoming more of a factor in companies' value proposition and how they attract new talent. So I think, rewind 5 years, how do I, as Barclays Bank or HSBC, or how do I attract people? Well, I was talking about the career development opportunities, and I was talking about the pay and the bonuses and all of those kind of tangible things. Whereas I think fast forward to now, people are much more when they're positive about remote working and they can offer that, they're shouting from the rooftops about that, especially if some of their competitors aren't. So I think it's becoming more of a distinguishing factor in the talent market. Like I said, for those organizations who are more kind of forward thinking and able to do it. And we are seeing people, leave organizations because I have to be in the office too often and it doesn't fit with me. Everyone adapted to a new, I hate that phrase, but a new normal in COVID, and you could, do your life responsibilities. We talked about the change in car usage, with people spending more and more time in their car for shopping and errands. People adjusted to being able to do that in the early part of COVID, and now their expectations are that I can do that as part of my normal working day. So yeah, I think it massively varies, but it's definitely becoming more central to value propositions and attracting talent. Yeah.
And Sue, I imagine that's something you're seeing organisations grapple with. This point about the value proposition in terms of come and work for us, we're doing the right thing. We may be proud for a profit organisation, but we're also one which wants to do the right thing by the environment and by our society. So you're seeing that in your work too, that ESG, whether it's phrased like that or not, issues are part of the offer to future employees.
Yeah, absolutely. And in employee engagement scores, we see that one of the key drivers of employee engagement is the company's commitment to, a net zero policy, or reducing emissions, or certainly diversity and inclusion is always a key part of that engagement driver. So yes, it's not really just a nice to have. If you want to have an engaged and high performing workforce, you need to be continuing to communicate about the things that you are doing, and that's often the case there where people don't know actually what their own company is doing when they may be doing a lot. And that's in the current environment. What I'm a little bit concerned about is that, because it's become such a hot topic, people just green hush instead, and actually there's a lot of value to be had, certainly from employers and from consumers' point of view, to know what companies are doing.
So yet again, we see so much aspects of that points of storytelling, narrative, consistency, and all of that. Well, these topics, I mean, they're so interesting how we work, how we get about the whole ESG agenda. We could carry on, folks, but we're conscious of your own agendas and timetables. So we're going to pause now and say thank you so much to our speakers, to Sue, to Jack, to Alexandra for bringing this together, to the team, Emily and Agnes, who've been making this happen behind the scenes, and to all of you for joining us and being with us this year. We're going to be back again at the end of next month, where we are going to be talking about brands. We're going to be talking about brands live with some very special guests, and think about what brand success looks like in 2025. But for now, thank you for being with us. We'll have the recording in your inbox with the slides tomorrow. It'll be online as well, and we're looking forward to working with you all during the months ahead. So thanks so much for being with us, and have a good rest of day.